the 4-minute warning. The sirens would go, and our actions when that went off, we had 4 minutes to scramble every aircraft that could fly off the base.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
5, 2, 7, 1, 6, 9, 8, 3.
Poland's military leader, General Jaruzelski, urged the Polish people tonight not to demonstrate on Tuesday, the second anniversary of the founding of the banned trade union Solidarity.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
Today we're speaking with Nick Anderson, who was a RAF Phantom jet fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force. We discuss flying in the Cold War and in detail how the RAF would have responded to a nuclear attack. We also talk about his time with the Quick Reaction Alert Units and how they worked, and we also hear details of a number of missions Nick flew intercepting the Soviet Tupolev Tu-95, codenamed the Bear by NATO. Before we start the episode, I wanted to thank everyone who's supporting the podcast financially via Patreon and one-off donations. Now, you might wonder what this Patreon is that I keep banging on about with every episode. Well, simply, it makes it dead easy to support the podcast. Just visit patreon.com/Cold War Pod. That's patreon.com/Cold War Pod. Choose your level of support. There's varying levels there, from $1, £1 or €1 up to higher levels, where you receive additional benefits. I then receive that amount monthly, and in addition, you get access to previews and other exclusive extras that don't make it into the free version of the show. So just go to patreon.com/Cold War Pod, or go to our website, coldwarconversations.com, and click on the Support the Podcast menu option. Now, back to today's episode. We start out by describing the Phantom itself and its difference from the US version. Don't miss details of the show notes at the end of this episode, where Nick has very generously shared some great photos of his intercepts with those Soviet aircraft, and there's some really interesting video there as well. We welcome Nick Anderson. Tell me about the Phantom, because I think you mentioned it's a two-seater.
The Phantom, well, we got the aircraft from the Americans because we had scrapped TSR-2 and gone as far as breaking all the rigs so that they could never, ever resurrect the project. The Labour government played with the idea of getting F-111s, but then binned that, losing their deposit, as it were. And the one thing they had decided that we were going to do eventually was to buy some F-4 Phantoms. Now, the version that they built for the Royal Air Force was different to all the other Phantoms that had been built. The government decided that they wanted a large British component built into this aircraft, and what they decided to do was to put Rolls-Royce engines in. So the Rolls-Royce Spey was the chosen engine. It had really only operated, basically as an airliner engine. And when they tried to squeeze it, to shoehorn it into the fuselage of a Phantom, they found it wouldn't fit. It was fatter, and it was a high bypass engine, so it needed a lot of airflow. So they needed bigger intakes, and they basically changed the shape of the fuselage. Now, when you're at high supersonic speed, the shape of the fuselage is actually quite important. In fact, the overall drag index of the aircraft needs to resemble something like an ogival body. A body that starts at a point, expands to a fat bit, and then retracts back to a point again. They call that area rule, and it reduced the amount of supersonic drag an aircraft experiences. So the initial Phantoms had been built with what they called a Coke bottle shaped fuselage, so that where the wings were, the fuselage was slim, and where the wings weren't, it was slightly fatter, and this gave it the lovely overall cross-section of size. And with our Phantom, we're squeezing that fat old spay in, they had to make the fuselage fatter. So it was quite an expensive airplane to build, because it was a different model completely to the ones that the Americans were building for themselves. It had a lot of problems with the engine, marrying this engine in and getting a reheat onto it that would work proved to be a big problem. The reheat on the J-79 powered Phantoms lights almost instantaneously. On ours, it took about 5 seconds, and it had to light in stages, because they discovered when they tried to light the reheat fast, it used to blow the engine out, and you'd often get flames leaping out of the front. And they had a lot of engine destruction, a lot of engine failures because of the reheat. So the reheat lit slowly and in stages. The Navy used to have a special modification so that they could get it to light fast when they were landing it on a carrier, in case they missed the wire and had to bolt. But we weren't allowed to use that mod, so we were stuck with that. The aircraft was a little slower, a little heavier than the American ones, and of course it was about the most expensive Phantom that anyone had built. But from our point of view, it was brilliant from an air defense point of view, mainly because of its fantastic radar. It had the Westinghouse AUG 11/12, depending on which version you flew, and it was a pulse Doppler radar. And that technology was still relatively new, and the Lightning didn't have it. In fact, Phantom was the only aircraft in the Air Force that had a pulse Doppler radar. And the wonderful advantage about that radar was that you could point it at the ground, and instead of receiving a huge, great big green return from the massive Earth that's underneath you, the radar completely ignored that. It didn't look for a return that was based on a time base like a normal pulse radar does, like the radar you get around an airfield, for example. It sends out a pulse, it hits an aircraft, you get the return, you measure the time that's taken, and you get a range. You know the azimuth because you know where the antenna was pointing when it picked it up. On a pulse Doppler radar, it measures the change in frequency that you get from your return. So if the aircraft's flying towards you, the frequency will be higher, and if it's flying away, the frequency will be lower. But whatever happens, the Earth is always the same return. It's always the same as your ground speed. And once you know that speed, which you can measure, then you can notch it out. You can remove that huge return that is the Earth's surface, which means the only things you'll see are things that are moving over it. And if you ignore low-speed things like cars and other, slow speed returns, then you will instantly pluck out aircraft that are flying. The great advantage of that was seeing things at level. The great disadvantage was you didn't know how far away it was, because not being able to use that time base, you couldn't calculate a distance. You could triangulate a distance using the antenna angle, and assuming the aircraft you're looking at was at low level, you'd look at your height, the antenna angle, and gauge a distance. But it wasn't until you locked the radar up did you get an accurate distance. And once you locked the radar up, they knew you were coming. So they'd often disappear. And of course, the one easy way for them to disappear was for them to turn at 90 degrees to us, so that they effectively were doing the same speed as the ground, and they'd disappear into that very notch that we used to take out so we couldn't see them anymore. Right. And that was a tactic they were the opposition were trained in to do that? Certainly are. All the Air Force guys knew how to do it. All the bomber pukes knew how to do it. If the Soviets were trained in that, I'm not sure. But let's remember that most of the most of the threat that we were expecting were going to be large-scale raids, not flown necessarily at low level, but medium level. So, we wouldn't just need to rely on pulse Doppler. We could switch on the pulse mode and use that to find guys, just as you would have done in a Lightning, for example.
Right.
Except because our radar the scanner was so big and it was so capable, we used to have a great range on that radar. We could pluck people out, 100 miles or more away from us.
And what were you told about the Soviets and about what their probable tactics were going to be in the event of a Warsaw Pact invasion? Well,
when I finished the OCU and got posted, I got sent up to RAF Lucas, which is in Scotland. So what we up there were expecting to do was, one, we had a big task to defend the Navy. The Navy no longer had any aircraft carriers, and we'd acquired all their Phantoms. And in return, we were supposed to be Atalanta signed and defend the Navy. So often we'd be way out over the ocean looking to provide air cover for the fleet with tankers there to give us fuel if we needed. And the rest of the time we were defending our little part of the coastline. Eastern UK, both right up northern Scotland and down, halfway down into England. And then, of course, you'd meet the Leeming squadrons and the rest down there. But so that was our area. Now we'd be expect to be stationed on patrols, 50, 100 miles out. And what we were expecting were regiment-sized raids of bombers, often nuclear armed, often with air cruise missiles. Although in those days, things like the Kangaroo they used to sling under the bear was the size of a Nat trainer. They were vast and pretty inaccurate, but the Soviets made up for that by having enormously powerful nuclear heads on them. So that was what we were expecting to attack. And these raids were going to come regiment-sized 10 or 20 aircraft at a time. So we needed to have a number of aircraft up to face them. Each aircraft carried 8 missiles. So we could probably take down, hopefully, 4 or 5 each. That would probably be a little bit optimistic because, of course, these aircraft would be contain self-defense jamming. They would have jammers mixed in amongst them who were more powerful and more dedicated. So we often worked in a strong ECM environment, electronic countermeasure environment, where both our radios were jammed and our radars were being jammed as well. And there was a great deal of training trying to deal with that kind of a threat. But that's what we were facing. And when we got airborne, expected to get airborne if we ended up in a fighting war, we fully considered the possibility that when we turned around to come back to our home base to land, there would be nothing there. We didn't expect to be able to stop every aircraft that was coming over. And if it was a nuclear war that we were going to face, then our base was going to be one of the prime targets where our families lived, all our friends lived, and, our squadron, our mates were all going to be there. And that's what we were fighting to defend. And we would regularly practice this type of an exercise where we would get squadrons of Vulcans would steam towards the UK, and we would be tasked to go up and intercept them and try and shoot down as many as we could in the time available. So it was all a very serious job. I mean, you can't get too serious when you're a young man in the Air Force, but the job was certainly very serious.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And were you given instructions as to what to do if nuclear war broke out and your base was destroyed?
Not really. We all talked about it. Obviously, you divert to any base that was still available and open. And most of us had taken a close look at what was around in Scotland. And I personally had picked out a stretch of the A9, which was going to be long enough and straight enough for me to park my Phantom. So that was my plan. If there was no one else to go, I didn't want to eject and dump the aircraft. I thought, well, if I can get it down on a piece of road, then, it might be of some use. It might be safer than ejecting. But, we would play these war scenarios very regularly. They were called TACEVALs, tactical evaluations. And the NATO monitors would come onto the base. The base would be put on a war footing, all done at no notice. And we would progress through an entire war in about 3 or 4 days, up to and including the BMEW's warning going off, which would indicate that the 4-minute warning, if you remember that. The sirens would go. And our actions, when that went off, we had 4 minutes to scramble every aircraft that could fly off the base. And I remember the first time I did it, I was allocated an aircraft, and I wasn't operational. I was just told to go out into this aircraft and check in on the radio when the sirens went off. And when they did, I ran out of this airplane, climbed in, and there wasn't an ejector seat in there. There was just a wooden box. And I sat on this box and plugged my helmet in and checked in on the radio. And BK Hinton, I think, one of my navs was in the back. And we couldn't start it up or anything. We just sat there and pretended that we were going to fly. But in theory, if the airplane could fly, regardless of what sort of situation you were in, the idea was just get it off the ground for the duration of the nuclear attack, and then try and put it down somewhere where it could be used in the future. But in reality, of course, that the chances of finding somewhere were pretty remote. Of course, the rest of the base, all the serviceable aircraft, just went steaming to the end of the runway. It was quite a sight to see, because you imagine you've got 2 full squadrons of Phantoms, and they're all trying to get airborne within 4 minutes. And the air traffic control didn't give any clearances. All they did was just give a continuous broadcast of the runway in use and the QFE, the pressure heading for your altimeter. And everyone sprinted for their airplanes, started them up, and we taxied to the runway just as fast as you could, onto the runway, no takeoff clearance. If there was another aircraft at the same time, you'd just line up beside them and go off as a pair. And then immediately behind you, aircraft would be pouring onto the runway, and the reheats would be going off, and these aircraft would just be pouring into the air. And often at night, the sight, if you weren't flying one, were quite incredible, watching 15, 20, 25 airplanes going off in such a short time and just disappearing into the black to go off and face whatever threat they were, were looking at. And the famous story of when the Navy was still on the base, when I first arrived, it was always a bit of a mark of honor if you were the first aircraft to get airborne on a survival scramble. And the Navy tried to go across the grass in this Phantom to get ahead of the queue. And he almost got bogged down. So he lit his reheats, and you could see this aircraft not pointing down a runway, 90 degrees, full burner, trying to get through the mud and grass and get onto the runway ahead of some other airplane that was going to...
Wow, that must have been, an incredible sight, seeing like a multi-squadron scramble like that. But
very much so, yeah. I remember doing an exchange with the German Phantom squadron. I think the base was not far from Munich. I think it was Eggebeck, although someone will probably correct me. And the squadron we spent some time with, did our little exchange with, their nickname were the Zapatas, Viva Zapata. And they were named after a Mexican revolutionary hero. And the reason for that was, in their early days, they had a squadron at either end of the runway. And when they got airborne on a survival scramble, both squadrons taxied to the closest end of the runway and started getting airborne. Of course, they were pointing at each other. And as they got airborne, they just jinked both turned right and passed each other. And there was an American observer, NATO observer, who looked at them and said, probably not in a very PC manner, "Oh my God, it's just like the Mexican Air Force." And they took it to heart. They thought, well, that's quite good. So apparently they wrote to the Mexican government and said, "We'd like to name our squadron or give it a nickname that is the same as a Mexican hero." And they were granted permission to use Zapata as their squadron name. What a great squadron they were, and a fine bunch of guys, and they all had these incredibly droopy Mexican moustaches. So that little anecdote on the side.
That's a great story. That I'd not heard that. I mean, I'm interested with and I've not probably looked into this, but with the Bundeswehr Luftwaffe, I'm presuming they couldn't name them after sort of heroes of previous Luftwaffe or anything like that.
Au contraire. This was a part of the Richthofen wing.
Okay.
So yes, they still did honor their war heroes, and to a certain extent, I think that was quite right. I mean, obviously, no one there wasn't going to be a Goebbels wing or a someone who had committed war crimes, but certainly the First World War aces were still, honoured and quite right in my mind.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So you're based up in Scotland. I understood that you were part of this quick reaction alert as well.
That's right. It was one of the primary duties we had. And at that time, we used to have a northern and a southern QRA, quick reaction alert. Now, there were quick reaction alerts for the bomber boys, particularly out in Germany, where they would have nuclear armed aircraft. The Vulcan boys, they down there at near Lincoln, Scampton and Waddington, those places, they would have had nuclear armed Vulcans, and they were always on readiness. There was always a number of them on readiness, just in case there was a no-notice attack. So we had a response, and from our point of view, we were the air defense, the sort of fighter response. So we maintained 2 aircraft fully armed every day of the year at initially 10 minutes readiness. So you can imagine at the end of the runway, in those days we didn't have hardened aircraft shelters. We were still a bit like World War II. We had concrete revetments scattered around, which is basically just concrete walls and no roof. But the QRA was maintained from a tin shed at the end of the runway, and it was. It's reasonably comfortable. You had a telly in there and a little room with a couple of bunks. And 4 of us sat in there, 2 aircraft. They had 8 missiles and 3 tanks on each aircraft. And when you came on duty at sort of 8 or 9 in the morning, you'd take over the aircraft and you would cock it. So you're a bit like cocking a gun. That was the idea. You would do all the checks you could do up to the point at which you really started the engines, and you prepare the aircraft with all the switches in the right place for a very quick startup. And the ground crew would fire everything up and check everything was serviceable. We even did engine runs to make sure everything was going to run. And then we'd partially disrobe by leaving our helmets balanced on the front of the cockpit, and our harnesses hung on the steps. And then we'd strip our immersion suits down to our waist because they're hot and uncomfortable to wear. And we'd stroll around, just basically sitting to wait and see if anything was going to happen. And, with 4 of you sitting around, often, you just pass your 24-hour duty period and nothing would occur. So you'd get a day off at the end of it and then back to the normal squadron work the next day. But every now and again, some Soviet aircraft would poke its nose into our airspace, and we'd be up there taking a look at them. So our airspace was just a sort of NATO area of interest, and it stretched most of the way to Norway, up around Faroes, almost up to Iceland, around the top of Scotland and then across to the west, quite a way into the Atlantic. And that was the northern QRA area. And then down to the south for southern QRA, it would go up to the French border in the Channel, go up around Ireland, and then off to the east towards northern Germany. And if the Soviets came into that airspace, or in fact anything that we were interested in, we would be launched to go and intercept them. Now, we initially were usually brought to cockpit readiness. So from a 10-minute state of readiness, our controlling authority, which was just up the road at a big radar base called Buchan, would come through on a secure telebrief line and give us a sit rep situation report, saying perhaps that there were a couple of zombies unidentified coming around. They give us a rough position, height and speed, and say if they continued on that course, we're anticipating a launch of Q1 at such and such a time. So you'd have a little bit of notice, and you'd nip off to the loo and perhaps grab a quick bite to eat so you weren't too hungry. And then they would, if it was premeditated, they'd bring you up to cockpit readiness. So the hooters would go, whoever was closest. When the aircraft was brought to cockpit readiness, would hit a big red button and the hangar doors would automatically crank back. And the ground crew, you often nearly trampled to death by them because they were terribly keen to get out there, and they had to get the electrics on the ground power units all fired up and make sure everything was set on the aircraft, pull all the missile pins so the missiles were fully armed and ready to go. And we'd leap up into the cockpit, sit down, strap in, helmets on, plug in, and then the aircraft had a telebrief line plugged into the tail end, which gave us instant and direct communications to the Sector Operations Center at Buchan, who were the people who were going to control the intercepts initially, certainly, and scramblers. And we'd check in at cockpit, and then we'd be given more information and often scramble from that point. Or if the targets turned around, then we'd sit there for half an hour or so, perhaps waiting for them to get out of the airspace, and then would be stood down. But when we were launched, it was then 5 minutes to fire up the engines, get all your checks done, get to the end of the runway, and get airborne.
Right. So this is from a cold start. It would take 5 minutes for you to get airborne.
Yeah, from completely, if you were sitting having a coffee in the crew room, 10 minutes. But you've been brought to cockpit readiness and you're already strapped in, you're up 5 minutes. We frequently did it in way less than that, because our aircraft, the FG-1, had no inertial navigation system to wind up. We didn't have much to wait for. Almost as soon as you started the engines, you could start taxiing. We always had absolute priority over any traffic that was around. So we basically trundled straight onto the end of the runway and roared off. It took no time at all.
And so then you're given a course heading to intercept whoever is in the NATO airspace.
That's exactly right. So the scramble instruction would give you angels, which is your height and thousands of feet to climb to, give you a heading, give you a frequency. We didn't actually give the actual frequencies. They were all pre-programmed, and we just selected a stud number. So call Buchan on fighter stud 63 or something, and we'd use that and decode that and get a frequency or pre-select it. And then we'd roar off on that heading. But from Lucas, we knew we'd have a few 100 miles to go before we'd get close to an intercept. So the initial part of it was just getting ourselves organized, checking in with Buchan, getting the latest information, getting a decent heading, and they would basically control you up towards the target if they could still see it. If it had dropped down to low level out of their radar coverage, they'd be predicting where it was going to come, and they'd put you on a CAP, a combat air patrol, which you was basically like a holding pattern. And every time you pointed in the threat direction, you'd use your radar to scan the sky. You'd cover a fair bit of sky, but only reached out to 100 miles or so. So it was much better if you could have an airborne early warning aircraft with us, which in the old days used to be a Shackleton. And to be fair, I used to love seeing the Shackleton, but it was slow and unwieldy. The radar was circa 1944 and wasn't brilliant. And despite the fact that they were wonderful people who flew them, operationally, we really needed something more modern, and we were always pleased when an AWACS, certainly later on in my career, came up. Those guys were magic, guys and girls. Although I did actually once work with a super constellation. I think the USAF, before the days of their AWACS, used to use super connes for their airborne early warning, and that was a sight to see, I tell you.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. How long did it take you then to reach the intercept normally?
You've got to, depending entirely where it was, really. It was probably 200 or 300 miles away. You're doing 9 miles a minute. So, we both do the math, 2 9s ready, 3 9s, 27. 45 minutes, perhaps, half an hour. And if we were the Q1 first launched off, and particularly if it was a no-notice scramble, we would go without any support. It would just be us. Quite often, they would then launch a tanker, and the tankers came from Marham, from down south, so they'd have to get up the coast to where we were. And as they came abeam Lucas, they'd launch Q2 to go and meet the tanker. And if we'd made the intercept, as we ran short of fuel, the tanker and Q2 would arrive, and they would take over, and we'd go back to Lucas and go back on readiness there, waiting to see if anything else occurred. And then Q2 would continue to monitor the Soviet aircraft, and every time he needed fuel, he'd just drop back to the tanker, who was probably 5 miles in trail, take some gas, top himself back up, and then he'd go back and continue with the shadowing of the aircraft.
Right.
And that way we had some pretty long missions. If you were there with the tanker, you could work for 5 or 6 hours without any problem at all. And quite often the missions, if it was a complex one, they might even have generated another aircraft to come up, who would come up with a second tanker, and would continue to monitor the situation with a Q3 aircraft. So we always had aircraft in readiness, and the squadron could generate more aircraft if they were required. In fact, had days when it was very busy. We got, Q4, Q5, began to wonder if the war had started. The number of airplanes around, particularly if there was a big NATO exercise on, or particularly a fleet exercise. The Soviets were always very interested, and they'd launch a lot of aircraft to go and monitor and find out what they could about that. So
right.
It's often very busy for us.
Yeah. So was it generally single aircraft you had coming over, or if there was an exercise, there would be multiple aircraft?
Rarely singles, usually pairs or perhaps a 4. Most of the time, Tu-95 bears of various marks, some photo reconnaissance, some maritime reconnaissance, some nuclear capable bombers. And
just to describe, for the bear is this large 4-engine turboprop.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's still flying now with the Russian Air Force.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it still remains the fastest turboprop ever built. Swept wing. I can't remember the name of the engines, but they were very powerful and drove 2 enormous counter-rotating propellers, 2 propellers for each engine. The props were over 12 feet in diameter. And they went so fast, the tips used to go supersonic, and they used to make a hell of a din and a lot of vibration, which we could feel and hear in the cockpit when you were formatting on them. Quite dramatic airplanes. So, yeah, they've been their mainstay for maritime reconnaissance and maritime attack for many a year, and no reason why they're not going to continue to use them for years, in the same way that the United States Air Force still fly the B-52 around.
Yeah. And so how would you approach the intercept? Would you come at them head on or from the side or from behind, or it just depended on what direction they're going in?
That's exactly right. So the aspect of the intercept was really set up by just the geometry of how it was all going to happen. We'd obviously try and get there as quickly as possible. So if it's head on, great. You can have great closure. If you're on a sort of 90, it's a pretty slack old intercept. You can't use the geometry to close, so you might use a bit of extra speed. But whatever, the idea was to get within visual range and then turn the radar off. The last thing we wanted to do was give more information about our radar frequencies and about the sort of things that you can pick up when you listen to a radar that's painting you. And we never locked the radar.
And presumably that was the whole idea they were coming over, was to test our defenses and see how we would react.
That is. They used to nibble at our defenses to see where and when we could intercept them, how quickly we could get to them. And sometimes we would deliberately not intercept them. Sometimes we would pre-position aircraft and catch them unawares. So we didn't just keep intercepting them all the time at the first opportunity, because that obviously gives them a definite red line. But we would show our willingness to intercept these aircraft all the time, inevitably, because you just, if you don't intercept them, then they will start to assume that they can come closer and closer and closer to the UK without any concerns. The idea was to show them that we could see them and we would keep an eye on them, and we were going to monitor their activity. And apart from this, they're not just trying out and playing with our air defense. They're actually there often on an operational mission. So they might be hunting our nuclear submarines, in which case they would be on an operational mission to go and drop sonar buoys and try and find out the whereabouts of our shipping, our Navy, and our submarines, in which case we would be monitoring them throughout, and we would often, watch these guys, and we'd be trogging along at medium level, and then they'd suddenly start descending and then entering sonar buoy dropping patterns, and we'd be watching what they do all the time to try and get what intelligence we could from them, as at the same time as photographing their airframes, noticing any new equipment they had on, just trying to find out how it was, how their aircraft were being developed. We always very keen to get the door numbers off the nose wheel doors. They painted a number there. That was one of the few indications of which airframe. But we discovered that it was also very important to get detailed pictures of all over the airframe, because knowing that we would record their door numbers, they often switched door numbers around, made up new numbers to make their fleets seem bigger perhaps than they were. And it was up to our intelligence boffins to use the art of dentology to find scratches and marks on the airframe that would indicate that even if the door number had been changed, this was the old number 63 that we saw last year, and back out again. Because there's one thing you can easily do, and that's hide a dink or a scratch that's on the outside of the airplane.
Well, if you enjoyed Nick's stories, I'm delighted to say there is more. A second episode will be coming soon, where we hear about Soviet countermeasures against the intercepts, including efforts to down RAF aircraft. We also talk about the end of the Cold War and the strange experience of entertaining Soviet pilots at an RAF base months after treating each other as mortal foes. I really recommend the show notes, as we have some great photos that Nick shared with us, as well as some fascinating video. The show notes are at coldwarconversations.com/the episode and the number 43. If you like what you're listening to, do join our Facebook discussion group, where there's loads of Cold War information and further discussions with our guests and other interested parties. Just search Cold War Conversations in Facebook. We're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod. Lastly, if you like what you're hearing, do leave reviews on iTunes. It really helps us to spread the word. Thank you very much for listening and supporting the podcast. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.